Alright, in this video we are going to finish up our gamepad input and we are going to address the button binding for our gamepad.
By editing the XML file that we put together for the keyboard earlier.
That's right, we're going to bind our gamepad buttons in much the same manner as we did the keyboard keys. So the very first thing we're going to do is go up here to our config.xml file and we're going to put together a series of gamepad binding commands. To get started, I'm going to grab one of the keybind commands, since the format of these commands, or nodes in the XML file, is going to be the same. We'll have a port, a device input, a game input, a player, and data.
Gotcha. So in the end, what are you going to change?
Just the name of the node itself to indicate that we're binding to the gamepad, and we'll change the information that goes into device input. For example, with this line that I copied here, a gamepad is not going to have an enter button.
Sure,
so
absolutely.
This is the side that we'll be changing.
Okay.
So the first thing we'll do is to indicate that these nodes should be used with the gamepad. We'll simply call these commands gamepad bind. And for the device input, let's start. We'll keep all of these in similar order, meaning go from the select to the back button, up, down, and so on. Now for select, we'll use the start button on the controller. So device input will be start. Now just like with the keyboard, if you're wondering what the actual names of each of the buttons are for use here in device input, we can always jump into the buttons enumeration and look through that. The easiest way to do that is to load up some place in code where you've got an actual case of the button's type, right-click on it, and jump to definition. And now we can see that if we scroll down, we have start listed here as one of the elements in the enumeration. So this is where we're going to be getting all of the names that we'll put in place as we bind up these buttons.
Cool.
So we've got start bound to select, and let's grab this line. Let's see here.
You need a total of 11.
Alright, so we'll grab
just
these.
to speed you up a little bit.
So we've got 1 and 11.
For the record, we're not using all of the buttons that exist on a gamepad. There's a few more you could use.
That's right. We're setting things up. We're actually setting things up so that we could use a Rock Band 1 drum controller.
Okay.
We're just leveraging the fact that, as far as the computer is concerned, a Rock Band controller and the gamepad look like exactly the same device.
Okay.
When you're inside of XNA and using the X-Input API, they'll look like the same thing.
Now, is that true of like the Ion drum rocker for Rock Band 2?
It is, in the fact that it still looks like just a normal drum controller. The difference is you have to interpret a series of input combinations.
Okay.
Because with the Rock Band 1 controller, there were enough buttons so that each drum just gets its own button.
Sure.
With Rock Band 2, you run into a scenario where you have cymbals introduced into the mix, and so you end up with more actual drums than you have open buttons. And so you have to start reading combinations of these.
Gotcha. And that's something we're going to look at way down the road. I just wanted to, bring it up.
Right.
So would you like me to go ahead and read off these bindings for you?
Sure, we can go down the list and start hooking these up.
All right. Well, down from start, you've got back, which is associated with back, so that should be real easy.
So back binds to back, easy enough.
D-pad up goes to game input up.
So D-pad up to just normal up.
D-pad down to down.
D-pad and grab some casing, and then that goes to down.
Right and left are the same thing. So D-pad right to right, D-pad left to left. That casing's fun, isn't it?
It is, especially when you have a lot of capitals back to back.
Yeah.
It just makes for more fun with typing. So next up, D-pad left.
Yes, sir.
To just left on the internal game input.
Yep, and then you're going to go with the A button, which is bound to note data 0. So you shouldn't have to change data.
Note
but
data is still 0.
Yeah, we're still going to start worrying about that now. So next one is Y, which is to note data 1.
So
B.
note 1.
B, which is to note data 2.
Note 2.
X, which is to note data 3. And we're actually one shy.
Note data 3. And
we need one more for left shoulder, which will be bound to note data 6.
So note data 6.
Now, on the keyboard, didn't we go up to note data 7? Or am I misremembering?
We did, but at this point we're out of drums if we're looking at a Rock Band 1 controller.
Okay, fair enough.
So we're just not going to reach all the way to track 7.
Gotcha.
Another thing to point out is that left shoulder is the input, the button press that you read when looking for the kick pedal on a Rock Band 1 drum kit.
Ah, okay.
Alright, now just like we did with the keyboard input, I'm going to space this out a little bit to make it form into easier to read columns.
Sure.
So we'll spend just a minute and tab some of this out. Because you'll notice with the different lengths of all the names we put in, that nicely messed up our formatting.
Now, I'm not saying you should or have to or might even want to do this, but if you were really creating this XML file for a user to potentially edit, would you want to comment these areas?
That I would leave to a matter of preference,
Yeah.
just because the names and the sections
They're pretty
are
self-explanatory.
verbosely named.
Yeah.
In the one that I'd put together, I just left it all standard. If you want to, of course,
Yeah.
this being a standard XML file, there would be nothing wrong with dropping comments wherever you feel that they're appropriate. So you could jump in here and do an HTML style comment and say,
Gotcha.
this is for the gamepad.
Gotcha. Okay, yeah, I mean, I'm not saying you have to, but like if you wanted to set it up so that a user could come in here and know, hey, you're supposed to change, your mappings, and then make sure you change the player if that's, necessary.
Or even to leave notes for yourself if you're making your own custom binding.
Oh yeah, check out your column list for player and see what you did right there.
Ah, yes, and going back to formatting, with everything getting skewed as it was,
Makes it a lot easier to see.
Yeah, I accidentally dropped what we were supposed to put into data into player. So let's copy these values over to data. So we have 1, 2, 3, and 6 being pasted into data. And let's take those out of player. There we go. Good eye on catching that. But yes, if you wanted comments, then you're free to put them wherever you can put standard XML comments in place.
Cool. I just wanted to make sure everybody got to see that in case they wanted to do that with their own XML files.
Though for this one, let's see. I'm going to go ahead and take
Oh,
this
you can
one
drop it, sure, absolutely.
And that should have everything set up nicely inside of the XML file now. So at this point, we need to turn our attention to the config class so that we can read in these bindings and start putting information into the actual gamepad map.
Awesome.
So we'll jump over here, we'll save out the config file, jump over to the config class. We're already looking at the method loadMapSet. And inside of here, of course, we have our loop that once it establishes that we're in the input section, grabs out all the different attributes, and then gets ready to begin binding.
Gotcha.
So here we did the check where we're seeing that up until now we've only had nodes that were named keybind.
Keybind.
So now we're going to need to look for
Gamepad bind.
gamepad bind.
Gotcha. Look at you go ahead and copy that.
Yep. Just getting a little bit lazy, so we can go in here right after our if statement and put in an else if. So we can check if node.name is equal to the same command we put into our XML node, which is gamepad bind. So if we're looking at a gamepad bind node, we instead want to take all this information we collected and apply it to the gamepad maps instead of to the key map.
And the functionality you put in here will be very similar to that which you've already put in for the keyboard.
Exactly. We need to do the same three things, only we're going to be using a button instead of a key, and we're going to be addressing a specific gamepad map instead of the one key map.
Right.
So really, we could start off here and almost just transcribe this line by line. We could start with the first line, which again, its purpose was to say that, hey, we have an incoming device input stored as a string. We need to resolve that out from its associated enumeration, then cast that to a number so we can store it. So in this case, we just need to change a few things. We'll call the number that we store button instead of key.
Sure, just for clarity.
And in our enum.parse line, the type of enumeration that we're parsing is buttons, not keys. And then device input is the same, and ignore case is the same.
Cool.
So that takes care of that line. Now this next one I'm going to type out just because I want to go into one main difference. Where originally we had a single key map and then grabbed an element, we're actually going to need to do addressing on two levels here, because once we load up the gamepad maps, we'll need to pick a specific gamepad map and then address an element inside of that dictionary.
Gotcha.
So what that means is we'll start, of course, with mapset. Now on mapset, we'll look into gamepad maps, which of course there are 4 of those. And this is where the port value really comes into play. If you remember on keybind, we never actually used that port variable in here. We ignored it and said, okay, the one and only keyboard, that is what gets bound.
Right. Well, because you only had one dictionary.
Exactly. Here with gamepad maps, we have 4. And we're going to use the port setting to address a specific controller. And then we have 1 mapping per controller. So that means port will actually allow us to look up the individual input map.
Right. Well, if you think about the dictionary system for the gamepad, like a boxed set of dictionaries, like a leather-bound box, looks really nice. You receive it for Christmas. We need to be able to specify which of the 4 dictionaries we're going to take off the shelf, and then which chapter we're going to flip to inside that dictionary.
Exactly. So that dictionary will be indexed by port. Now, once we've pulled a dictionary out of the box, we can see that if we were to look at it, we've got things like try get value. So at this point, we're now addressing a specific dictionary. But it's not the whole dictionary we want. We want a specific element inside the dictionary. We want to bind the element for whatever button is coming in.
It's like saying volume 3, page 26.
Exactly. So now it's like we need to open up that page inside the dictionary, and we'll do that with a second set of square brackets. So we'll open up and say that we're going to be addressing page or element button inside of the dictionary. And now we're looking at now we've actually got a slot into which we can store an input data struct. So we can set this equal to new input data, and then we simply form an input data out of named input, player, and data. So we've got our named input variable, our player variable, and our data variable.
Awesome.
And that takes care of getting the information loaded into our mapping dictionary. The last thing we need to do is we need to remember to add the button to the gamepad inputs bound buttons list, since that's what it's going to use to look for buttons and check their state. So we'll take our gamepad input. So gamepad input dot add button, and then we'll just feed in the current button. Now, once again, we're taking in an actual enumeration element, so we need to cast this over to buttons before we actually pass it in. But with that put together, now we should be able to build. We have no errors. Well, I'll let it finish before I say that. There we go. Now we have no errors.
He'd already read it, and he knew.
So at this point, we should be ready to load up the game and test it out.
Cool.
We've got a standard corded Xbox controller that we're using to test this with. So if we begin hitting buttons such as the A button, we get a note for track 0, so data 0 and player 0. If we hit the Y button, we get data 1. If we hit B and X, we get the other
You're
data
so cool.
elements.
Yeah, you're like actually checking your notes so you know what's about to come up. I just start pounding buttons and just see what's scrolled across.
I'm actually cheating a bit. I'm looking over here at the original mapping sheet.
Oh, cheater.
So looking at the rest of this...
What about shoulder button?
Let's see, shoulder button, left shoulder. That's giving ourselves note 6.
Awesome. What about the back button?
So back button is bound to back.
Start button.
Bound to select.
Cool.
So up and down, bound to up and down, as well as left and right. So everything is looking very good on the controller.
We could do the contra code.
And also to note, we can also use the keyboard, so hitting the keyboard keys, up, down, left, right, then hitting the gamepad, up, down, left, right, now looks exactly the same.
Right. Well, because the system's not selective. It's not being exclusive. It's not saying, we can use a gamepad or a keyboard right now.
Right, and that's the nice thing about the unified input system, is now inside the game, it doesn't care if input's coming from a keyboard, a controller, or anything else.
Or both.
And then one last thing to point out is, just with the example that you gave when we were setting up the keyboard input, how we set up a second row of keys to give a player 2.
Sure.
We could do the same thing with our gamepad. You'll notice that these are all player 0. If we, for example, set the controller to be player 1 throughout here, meaning
make a second block of the same things.
Then we'd have a setup where the keyboard was one player and the controller was another player.
Right. And that's why I was saying earlier that, if you're doing this on your own, you want to set it up for a lot of different players, maybe up to like 4 separate controllers, it might be useful to start dropping in comments, just so that you can see at a glance what block goes with each player.
Exactly. But I think with that, we've got our configuration reading, and everything tested, so that will take care of this video.
All right, awesome.